What are we talking about today?
Let's talk about the graveyard.
Okay. Enough of the theatrics.
Distraction makers.
We're going to talk of everything about the graveyard.
Yes. Everything.
Everything.
Everything you could ever think of, except for the thing that most of you are thinking of.
Right.
And except for the one thing you specifically want us to talk about. We're not going to talk about that, but we'll talk about everything else.
And you're going to put it in the comments, and we're going to be like, oh, yeah, we forgot that.
Yeah. You're going to talk about some obscure card, or there's going to be some new card that just came out in some set that everyone's talking about.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about that.
No. While you're down there in the comments, though, like and subscribe.
That was smooth. That was good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you think about how sort of like play patterns emerge and different ways to create different feelings in a player, things moving into and out of a zone tend to create places where mechanics can be created. So, in Magic, you have your hand, you have play, you have exile, or battlefield. You have, what's funny is it's not even going to be battlefield anymore. It's just going to be enters.
Yeah.
Enters
so you have
what?
The enter zone.
The enter zone.
Yeah.
Then you have the graveyard. Then you have command zone. There's probably some others. But when the graveyard in particular, right? So when a card enters the graveyard from any other zone, we've seen mechanics be created for almost all of these different places, right? So if a card goes directly from a hand to graveyard, it's discarding, but that gives us the option to work with a mechanic on either end of that, right? So something that's like, well, if I discard a card, I can get an effect on a creature if there's like an activated ability of some sort. But then one step further, we have madness, which is like, okay, well, now I get the discard and I also get to play the card.
Right.
And you could do it the other way around, where like an opponent's like makes you discard a card, and now they could get a bonus. I guess if you make your opponent discard a card, you could have some kind of value come from that zone change as well. There's also like going from play to graveyard when something dies. There's ways to trigger off of that. There's also like what's a bunch of different mechanics for different card types once they're in the graveyard and then they leave the graveyard.
Right.
Things like flashback, unearth, retrace, whatever.
Right.
So really what the graveyard ends up kind of becoming, and other zones too, but the graveyard in particular is almost an extension of a player's hand, right?
So I think when talking about graveyards, we could talk about very specifically in Magic, but I think in game design in general, you could essentially have a game without a graveyard. Mm-hmm. And you use cards and then they just go away. They're gone forever. So Hearthstone is a game that does that. It's a game that is done a very good job of taking a lot of things that are normally maybe seemingly complex, or taking information that maybe might not be necessary to the majority of a casual player base, and they're sort of just saying like, don't worry about that. And so you can't look at your graveyard in that game.
Right. One, and I do wonder how much of this, especially in Magic's case, is that like the cards physically exist in the space, right? So when like you need a discard pile, right? So when you play something, it has to go somewhere, right? If it's not in play, where does it go? Right. It goes to the graveyard. But since the cards are physically there in front of you, creating mechanics that sort of utilize that space makes a lot of sense. But it definitely, Hearthstone in particular, chunks that complexity for the player in a really good way. Yeah. In that they're like, okay, it's gone, just doesn't exist, don't worry about it.
Right. And then there's even a possibility of games that, let's say you end up using a card. There's the possibility of games that you can play a card, and then once the card is destroyed or goes away or something after its use, maybe it's still in the field, but it's just deactivated, right? And it's just not there anymore. But like you're saying, when there's physical cards there, and it makes sense to sort of remove unnecessary information, it makes sense to utilize that zone. The flavor of the zone being the graveyard feels very like obvious, I feel like, in hindsight, even though it's a little weird that you have a library of spells, but then you have a graveyard, but it's whatever. I don't know.
I mean, what's the discard of the library? The dumpster?
The dumpster.
Yeah. So
that's
you got
what
the library and the dumpster?
Should have been called the dumpster.
That makes sense.
Yeah. The dump. You mentioned it being an extension of your hand, essentially. And I feel like that kind of is what most graveyards and games end up sort of becoming, is that the minute that you have the opportunity to have a card go from your hand as hidden information down into known information on a field, and now is available to your use. If you have cards that let you have that card be available to you, it becomes much, much more consistent than if you were instead were just to be drawing off the top of your deck, because you know what you're going to be getting from the outcome of that.
Yeah, the graveyard, I feel like, exists in a weird space in between known and unknown information, right? It's like obscured information,
right.
which is I think a hard space.
It's worse.
Yeah, it's hard to navigate that space, I think, as a designer, when like you want things in the graveyard to matter, you want to be able to use that as a way to create new mechanics and things.
Yeah.
But it's tough to make sure that players aren't feeling like they're blindsided by what comes out of it.
Yeah.
That I think, especially when like I have a dredge deck in Commander, and like my graveyard's huge, right? It's like almost my whole deck, or whatever. And then how is anybody supposed to reasonably look through all my stuff that I could do?
Right.
You know, like it's just not a,
like, we don't know, because I played against it multiple times, and I only know even now a handful of the cards that are like, oh, I've seen you play that before. Right. That's probably important. That like, yeah, at a certain point, you just have to know like every single one of those cards, as opposed to if you just have a really strong creature on the field, you know what that creature's capable of. But when everything's in the graveyard, you don't know, one, you could bring it back with something in your hand, or it has an ability that cares about the graveyard.
Yeah, I think graveyard being the flavor here makes so much sense in this context, right? Because it's something that sort of like has happened that you thought was dealt with and now is back, right? Very much similar to like a zombie or a skeleton or something that's like rising from the dead, right? If like that flavor is perfect for what the discard pile is. I think what ends up a little strange is like a card with flashback that, you know, is an instant or sorcery in the graveyard is really just an extension of your hand, but it's technically known information. Again, it's that obscured information territory.
If someone has to know, like, okay, I don't know what they could do from their hand, but I see what mana they have, and I know they could cast that thing. But you don't want to have to keep asking, like, can I see your graveyard? What do you got? Yeah,
for sure. But and like obviously this gets filtered through the information exchange of mana, which is cool, right? The like you said, you get sort of like obscured information coming through mana sources, right? Like, okay, well, theoretically you have the possibility of some stuff you could do, but it's narrowed by how much mana you have untapped. And how should be narrowed by how many cards you have in hand. But, you know, if you have a flashback card in the graveyard.
Part of me kind of wonders if this would be alleviated if, I'm not saying they should do this by any means, but if there was a secondary graveyard zone, essentially, that it is an all-encompassing, you know, flashback zone. And it's not like flashback is a big enough mechanic for this, but if there's dredge, flashback, graveyard matters type things, it means that all that stuff would be front-facing, and players could then see, like, oh, that this is their possibility here.
That's actually how I tend to organize my graveyard in Commander, even though it's technically against the rules. You're supposed to keep your graveyard in order.
Really?
Yeah. So if I was playing in a tournament, you have to like lay your graveyard out like card after card after card. There are cards that care about the order of the graveyard.
Really?
They don't make them anymore.
Okay.
So if you're playing in particular formats, I don't think it matters as much. But I'm pretty sure just like blanket rule, cards in graveyards are supposed to remain in the order in which they enter.
Yeah.
But when I play my dredge deck in Commander, I'll separate into like 3 piles of like stuff that matters, stuff that might matter, and then stuff that doesn't matter at all, basically, which helps, but like it's a lot to manage. Oh, so funny enough, the old cards that have flashback on them, they put a little icon on the top of the card name, the little gravestone.
Yeah.
I fucking love the little gravestone.
I love the little gravestone.
They don't do it anymore.
I want to bring it back. You're right. I totally forgot they did have that because they saw this as a problem.
Yeah, and they were like, how do we give just a little reminder that, hey, there's something here?
Yeah, I forgot. I just pulled up my card Valor, I think, and it has a little graveyard on it. I love it. Yeah.
I love that little gravestone. Little cute little gravestone.
You know what? Let's petition to bring back the gravestone.
Bring back the flashback gravestone.
Obviously, make the icon better, but you know,
it's fine. It feels charming, you know.
Yeah, is that what they're going for? Maybe you're right. It could come in Bloomberg. Although we talked about that in the Threshold episode.
Yeah, nobody's gonna know anything. Yeah. I mean, I love the graveyard. I love interacting with the graveyard. I love the flavor that comes out of it.
I know you do.
I think it's it is like one of the best places to get resources and value out of the game, and it does a great job of creating a game within a game, right? Where if I'm planning to utilize my graveyard as a resource, other players can play cards that make it so that's not possible, right?
I see. The game that I play when you're playing your graveyard game is I play Go Fish, where every turn I ask if Wonder's in your graveyard.
Right, that matters.
Yeah, and then you say no, not yet.
Right. You're like, am I dead?
Yeah.
Not yet. Wonder's not the graveyard. Let's just talk about design implications in terms of like things to consider, game design wise in terms of utilizing the discard pile / graveyard.
I think it's funny because when you really, if you were to look at things from like very, very focused game design standpoint and you just wanted what's necessary for the game, I think right now, a lot of people are so they're so used to the concept of trading card games, and their brains are so they got the trading card game brain rot that like you just assume like, oh, you got a graveyard, you got a discard pile,
and you can utilize it somehow,
right? And you utilize it somehow, and like, but really, if you were to think like, what's necessary for this game to function, I think graveyard would be the thing that I'm like, yeah, don't need it, like just get rid of it.
Yeah,
like,
once things have left the field of play, whether that's from your hand or the actual battlefield or whatever,
remove that information from your brain, from your opponent's brain.
Yeah.
Keep it simple.
I think it is definitely a good way to bring down the sort of upkeep complexity of a game. It's that, okay, well, it's gone now. You don't have to worry about it anymore.
And I think it's funny because, I mean, looking through some of the older Magic cards, you could see like it took 2 sets before they were like, now you can have opponents start
touch it at all.
Right. Yeah. Which I think is good in general. We talk a lot about making sure that your game has enough different knobs to it. Knobs being different points of interaction that the players can have. Now, you could essentially have a game that doesn't have a graveyard, and that would be fine, but you are losing a point of interaction or potential interaction for future development.
Lots of points of interaction, because it's not just about like the graveyard itself, it's also like every other zone that interacts with it.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, it's essentially, right. If, for instance, you have a battlefield that interacts with a graveyard, you could have a graveyard that interacts with a battlefield. And so it sort of ends up, I don't know what math that is, exponentially, maybe, decreases.
Exponentially increases your
if you include
knobs.
it. Yes, it exponentially increases the different points of interaction that you could have, which is great. But what I think is funny is like it doesn't mean you have to have a graveyard in a game. You can have other zones. You could have different points of interaction to make up for that. You might be missing out on flavor potentially, but that's so game dependent.